So, have you ever been bitten by a wasp? A wasp is known as a tataya in Hindi. A wasp sting can be a very painful affair. Something similarly painful is happening to many people today. These are the army of liberals, self-appointed intellectuals, powerless opposition leaders withering away in the heat of their insignificance, morality keepers, secular watchdogs of the nation. And let us not forget the media luminaries who are ignored by the present regime. They are thirsting to get back in the thick of things and be somewhat relevant in the eyes of the government. Hi, and welcome all to the CAA show. My name is Juggi Bhasin. CAA is, of course, conversation and analysis. So, why do I say that it seems that they have all been stung by the tataya? I say this because they're all hopping mad, stung by the reorganized cabinet, which has taken the wind out of their sails. It has silenced to a great deal their daily droning against the government's handling of the pandemic. In boxing terms, it was as if someone had hit them with a sucker punch, knocking the air out of their chest. But do not worry, because they are fallen but not out. They're getting up and spinning a new narrative of the reorganized cabinet, which essentially makes fun of this overhaul. The main points of their ridicule narrative are as follows. The first point, the entire cabinet has been reworked on narrow casteist lines, they say. What happened to the so-called single Hindu identity? Second point, new faces and fresh blood in the cabinet will not make a difference. The PMO still calls the shots and won't let anyone else work to their potential. Third point they make, Mr. Prakash Javadekar, Dr. Harshvardhan and Ravi Shankar Prasad had become the fall guys to protect the brand called Modi. These gentlemen had to pay the price for the incompetence of the Prime Minister. The fourth point they make, there is a conspiracy behind the exits of these ministers. Maybe another entity, perhaps even America, pressured the PM to drop these ministers. And so the conspiracy Dhobi list goes on and on. So let me try and separate fact from fiction. The Hindu identity rests not on a homogeneous block, but on a heterogeneous array of caste plates stacked on each other. So just because the Congress in its time, in its heyday, used to have a Brahmanical superstructure of decision makers with some elitist Muslims in the ring, who, by the way, could not even win an RW election on their own, does it mean that the BJP is obliged to follow the same model? The BJP is giving ministerial representation to even subcastes in the Hindu pantheon, to give a share of the pie to everyone. How is that so hard to understand? How can it be a narrow partisan exercise? A consolidation of a pan-Hindu identity can only come if all the castes are empowered in the pantheon. The liberal sympathy for the dropped big three ministers is hypocritical, and the charge that the PM should have taken the flak for poor decision making is also laughable. Perhaps the liberality had the model of Dr. Manmohan Singh in mind as a shining example. In that dispensation, if you remember, every minister was doing his or her own thing, answering only to Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, or perhaps to that extra constitutional authority called the National Advisory Council. If today the Prime Minister's office coordinates all the ministries to streamline decision making, what is so wrong about that? Should ministers become autonomous power centers answering only to extra constitutional authorities? Is that what the opposition and the Darbar media is demanding? As to the charge that America or some other entity forced the PM to take these decisions, to my mind, that is complete wastage of any print space or airways or comment, because these kind of conspiracy plots go on and on. more important thing is to move beyond just the cabinet overhaul and and look at the wider picture and then analyze the people who are so critical of the government. I have wondered as to why are all these people so bitter against the government and find something to criticize in almost everything that the government says or does. And then the penny drops. The clarity comes that these critics of the government today are the same people who held powerful positions in the past before 2014. And being out of power and being irrelevant is certainly not a happy place for them. Of the lot, three faces come to mind today. There are, of course, many, many more, but I believe that all these three men have something in common. The first one that comes to mind is Mr. Sanjay Baru of the accidental Prime Minister fame. Today, the veteran journalist has become a fierce critic of the Modi government. This was the same man, if you recall, who Dr. Manmohan Singh had picked out of relative obscurity in 2004 to appoint as his media advisor and spokesperson. Dr. Singh, in some respects, took this decision because Mr. Baru's father had been a work colleague of his. In 2014, Mr. Baru repaid the trust that Dr. Singh had reposed in him by publishing The Accidental Prime Minister. In his book, he shrewdly mocked Dr. Singh for being subservient to Mrs. Sonia Gandhi and looking the other way when corruption flourished all around him and under his nose. Perhaps Mr. Baru had never heard of the saying, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, or let us say in the Indian context, what happens in the PMO stays in the PMO. He betrayed Dr. Manmohan Singh ostensibly to gain favor with the incoming BJP government. But the new government was least interested in him. Mr. Baru waited and then waited some more, and then frustrated and angry at being ignored, became a bitter critic of the BJP government. It is almost the same story for the two other gentlemen, Mr. Arun Shourie and Mr. Yashwant Sinha. Mr. Shourie is the same man who had written a book called The World of Fatwas. In this book, he had blasted the Muslim community on every conceivable aspect of their religion. And some of the readings from that book are nothing short of inflammatory. When Mr. Modi won decisively in 2014, Mr. Shourie was convinced that he would become the finance minister under the new dispensation. He even gave interviews to print and TV media about this. But like Mr. Baru, he too was overlooked by the new government. Almost overnight, he became a bitter critic of the Modi government and became a demigod and elder spokesperson of the secular liberals. As a corollary, one question has always baffled me. In this world of cancel culture, why has Mr. Shourie not been cancelled by the liberal secularists for his remarks and writings against the Muslims? I guess this is one answer I'll never get. And lastly, there is, of course, Mr. Yashwant Sinha. He held important ministerial portfolios in the Vajpayee government, but he was given the cold shoulder by the Modi government. So the next thing we know is that Mr. Yashwant Sinha goes hammer and tongs at the Modi government. And in pursuit of his personal ambitions, maybe, just maybe, he ended up ending the promising career of his own very talented son, Jayant Sinha. And so, it leads me to infer that the criticism of the government, at least from these gentlemen, comes not so much from an inherent sense of values and beliefs. Rather, it comes from the fact that their personal ambitions were not fulfilled by the government. It also comes from the sense of entitlement that each of these people had. It is well known that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Well, in these politically correct times, these gentlemen have gender neutralized this phrase. It is now safe to say, therefore, hell hath no fury like a person scorned, especially a person who held power before 2014. So that's all from me for today. Keep watching this space and please do subscribe to us. Cheers and goodbye till next time, everyone. And we will meet hopefully tomorrow again with a brand new topic.